In March of 2018, I interviewed Robert Leyland, the lead developer of the Sega Saturn exclusive Ghen War. Based on my findings, it came out sometime in October of 1995, originally planned for the original Saturn launch date, Saturday, September 2nd. When I interviewed Mr. Leyland, I'd thought Ghen War had come out earlier, and thus was earlier on in my list of games to review. So when I interviewed him in March of last year, I thought my review of the game would come out in like a month or two. But then when I found out that a lot of my release date info was inaccurate due to the sources I was using, Ghen War got pushed back. Top that off with a whole bunch of other real-life responsibilities that ultimately got in the way of me working on this series at all, and my interview with Mr. Leyland got delayed as well by a lot. It's been more than a year. Now again, because of real-life responsibilities, my review of Ghen War probably won't come out for a little bit. I'm still working on it. But I wanted to get this interview with Robert Leyland on the internet so that you guys could hear it. He sheds a lot of light on what development for the Saturn was like in North America before and after the console came out. He talked about what it was like hearing the news of the surprise launch 2 days before it even happened, what dealing with Sega management was like, and a lot about the hardware itself. One thing he mentioned on Facebook that didn't make it in the recorded interview, the development manuals they got from Sega of Japan were really poorly translated. This, of course, made working with the hardware pretty challenging. They ran into a whole bunch of other problems, not just with Sega, not just with the hardware, but with other things too that happened while they were working on the game, and I think it sheds a lot of light on both Ghen War itself and really the Sega Saturn as a whole. So if you're a hardcore fan of the Saturn, I'd really recommend listening to this entire interview. Robert Leyland gives a ton of good info here. A couple of things I need to make note of beforehand. At the time of recording, my audio equipment was pretty bad. You're going to hear a lot of audio cut out, and there'll be sections where my camera cuts out, so there's going to be some missing clips, but I would say about 97% of the interview is still intact and very listenable. The point is to have this information out there for you guys to listen to. I want to apologize to the people who follow this channel for holding on to this interview for so long, but more importantly, I really need to apologize to Robert Leyland. Dude, I am really sorry for sitting on this interview for more than a year. Just a bunch of stuff kept coming up with real life and with this series. I wanted to make sure this was uploaded with the review of Ghen War, and I wanted to make sure that both of those things were uploaded when Ghen War came out in my timeline of release dates. So kind of a stack of things really got in the way of me getting this interview online. So again, dude, really sorry about that. So as I said, my review of Ghen War will come out in probably a week or two, maybe longer, depends on how much free time I wind up getting. You can expect more interviews like these, assuming I'm able to keep getting in touch with developers from the past. A note to anyone listening, if you are a developer of a Sega Saturn game, I would love to interview you. Please get in touch with me. Look at that clown, I even tried dressing up for it. What a nerd. A quick note about Robert Leyland, he's been a developer for a long time and recently entered retirement. In terms of more recent games, he's well known for the Skylanders series. So a big giant thank you to Robert Leyland for agreeing to do this interview, and another apology for waiting so long before finally getting this online. Here it is. I guess the first question, when did you guys totally start developing? When did the team get together and say we're gonna start making Ghen War?
Well, okay, so we had been working on and off for Sega for a while. We did a product. We did a couple of products on the Genesis. I worked on the Toe Jam and Earl a game, and then subsequently I worked with a guy named Greg Hammond, who was the lead designer and artist for our thing. He doesn't get any credit. I noticed I just checked on Wikipedia. He should get credit on Wikipedia. I don't know why his name isn't on there. And we did a game called Racing Aces, which was a airplane racing game using 3D terrain, which is kind of hard to do on the Genesis, but we'd kind of pulled it off. So showing some technical prowess, they put us on the Saturn console, and the Genesis had been really successful, and Sega was thinking they would continue their success with the Saturn, and they had this 32X product that was an in-between, but as so often happens with the big companies when they have a really successful product and try to repeat the success, they forget what it was that made them successful. And what made the Genesis successful was Sega's willingness to work with third-party developers to produce software. And on the Saturn, they were a lot less willing, or a lot less. I hate to say, a bit full of themselves, and it was really hard to get good technical documentation, and the hardware was really complicated, so it made it harder for third-party developers to do products. And But I mean, we had fun. It was in some ways it was an amazing system. It had really powerful hardware, and the graphics engine was quite powerful. It was flawed in one tiny little respect that Sony stomped Sega on, which was it couldn't draw polygons very well. It could do sprites, it could do backgrounds and 2D graphics fantastically. Probably better than any other console system, even to date. But it couldn't draw polygons to save its life. um, and The result was that the world was headed towards 3D games, and Sega hadn't recognized it. And for whatever reason, their management wouldn't bend and get a decent polygon engine. Rumors were that they were trying to, and I know several people wrote, several of the developers, and including us, wrote them and said, "Hey, look, this is a flaw. This is not a good design. This needs to be fixed." And by the time we got to that point, it was already, I think, a little too late, and they'd really missed the boat on that. Having said that, though, the rest of the system was actually pretty amazing. The sound system was really good. The graphics. So the CPU was fantastic. It was streets ahead of the PlayStation, which was the main competitor at the time. Yeah. Did I answer that question? I think I might have rambled, got sidetracked.
No, that's fine. No, it's all great information. I don't think you rambled really.
Yeah.
I guess. So you talk a lot about how the Saturn can't really draw polygons to save its life. Like, kind of what was dealing with that like then?
Well, when you go to draw a polygon, what the Saturn could do is they implemented a very fast line drawing chip. The chip could draw lines very quickly. So they decided to draw polygons. They would walk the lines down and draw from one corner to another, and then just step down to the next corner, drawing lines across. And the result of that was you could draw a quadrilateral, a four-sided, four-point polygon, but it didn't look right because the textures that you were drawing as the line were going would get stretched and warped in funny ways. And it actually, and sometimes it helped. It helped with the perspective, getting the perspective correct. That method gives you a better perspective mapping than the Sony had. The Sony didn't do perspective correct textures. But the problem with it is that whenever you try to draw a quadrilateral, if you're trying to draw it as you're trying to draw triangles. And when you're trying to draw a quadrilateral, you end up with curved shaped objects like a potato chip rather than a flat polygon. You end up with a weird potato chip shape. And once we found that out, we tried to use it. So some of the shapes and the characters in Ghen War have odd shaped curvature to them, and that was done sort of kind of using the flaw in their engine to make it look better. But so you could do stuff with it, but it wasn't ideal. Let's just say that. Yeah.
Right. So did you guys wind up making a lot of, like, with lack of better phrasing, curvy shaped characters and stuff like that because of that potato chip issue you had there?
Yeah, and even the terrain as well. We would try to use it to make the terrain. The problem with the curvy shape was that as something animated, the curve changed, right? So the texture mapping on the curve changed. So you couldn't use it everywhere. You had to be judicious in how you used it, because otherwise it was visually distracting. Yeah,
I
yeah,
bet.
yeah, yeah.
Was this the first 3D game that you had ever made, or had you made polygon-based 3D games prior to Ghen War?
No, we hadn't. The thing is, the systems didn't have polygon capabilities prior to the fifth generation. Before the fifth generation, the systems we made polygon games with polygons in them, but we had to do it by simulating the polygons. So yes, I'd done 3D graphic stuff on the PC, on the PC and family of games, but on the consoles it wasn't really possible. Most of the systems used character-based graphics. I think one of the first systems to have a polygon capability was one of the Nintendo ones, maybe the Super Nintendo, because they had a couple of games that used polygons, but they were just flat. They had no texturing, so you do some simple stuff with them, but the real capability was there. But I'm speaking out of ignorance because I don't know that system very well. Yeah. So, but as I said, on the Genesis, we'd done a 3D game using terrain, height map terrain, and that transferred into Ghen War and then subsequently Congo, the third product that our group did. It was, I think, the first time we had done. I mean, we'd done shooter type games before. I think it was one of the first times we tried to do a first person shooter, and we had some really interesting moments. Like, there's a real learning curve in making first person shooters. Particularly in those days, this was because you weren't using a mouse on the consoles, you have to use a joystick. Getting aiming and tracking and stuff like that working in a console environment without a mouse. Like, the mouse gives you some precision for movement control. And it was an interesting transition because we'd done joystick games early on the PCs before, like the old Apple II games were joystick games. Then mice came along and changed the way you interfaced with the game. And then we go back to consoles, and now we're joysticks again. So there were some odd transitions going backwards and forwards between the two. It was kind of fun. You have to do stuff to help the player, to aid the player. And in some ways, that's like good gameplay, because what you're trying to do really is entertain the player and provide the player with an enjoyable experience. It's not as important to provide super hard challenge, because just the nature of the game itself, the games themselves make them hard. The super hard challenge you can provide by, like on a PC, you get super hard challenge by playing against human opponents, because humans are super hard. But if you have to play against an AI, that's the introductory sections of games like Call of Duty are so easy because the computer AI is so bad.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And so, with development, you guys were making this game before the Saturn had like completely released in America, and as I had said in that Facebook message, it's kind of my understanding that back in like early 1995, Sega had said, "Look, we're gonna release this in early September." They even had a name for it. They called it Saturn Day. They like had a whole deal about it, but then all of a sudden, May 11th rolls around, and knock knock, here comes the Sega Saturn surprise release. And
Yep.
was this something that you guys had known about before May 11th?
No, I think we found out about it about a day or two beforehand, and nobody really had time to react. It was more like, they're what? But I thought we were going to be a launch title. In fact, they had already sent us preliminary artwork for the boxes with titles, with launch titles on them. Like the cardboard packaging for the console had a wrapper, right? And on the wrapper were pictures of a bunch of different games, including ours. that were supposed to be on it. And then they released on May 11th, and I don't remember if those pictures were on the box or not. I don't think they were. Um, and then by September, they'd already blown 4 months of, 4 or 5 months of marketing.
Right.
Yeah, and only had two titles, I think, 2 or 3 titles. Yeah.
So they'd sent you guys like artwork for as if it were a release game.
Well, they got from us preliminary, like a title screen and some like gameplay footage, and they used that to create pictures to put on the outside of the box, of the console box. And I guess there were like a half dozen games that were slated for release on Saturn Day, and they were I can't even remember the titles, but I know ours was one of them. Ghen War was one of those titles, and it had the so we'd given them some preliminary artwork. I mean, it was pretty far along in development by the time that happened. I mean, and this was probably in April and that stuff. I don't know if it was on the box at the time of release. I guess if you looked on if you had some artwork for the release box, you'd be able to find out.
Kind of talk about like how that took you guys by surprise. You guys had just did somebody walk in and say, "Hey, I just saw Saturn sitting on the shelf at KB Toys," or was it like,
Oh no, it wasn't quite that bad. No, we were they let us know. We were talking with our producer, and he said, "Look, we're releasing it. Like we're doing a surprise launch or something." I don't remember the exact details, but I do remember us going, um, "We're doing a surprise launch," and we understood that it was. I mean, even though it wasn't like officially mentioned, it was because they knew that Sony was releasing the PlayStation. They were going to be releasing the PlayStation before the Saturn, and so they were trying to do it to steal some of their thunder. And it was sort of a kind of like how Hollywood releases their movies at different times. They want to stagger the release and get the press. But uh, and it's hard to tell if it was a good thing or a bad thing. But I mean, ultimately, I think it ended up being a bad thing. But at the time, it wasn't clear that it was a bad decision. It was one of those things where it's like, oh, okay, well, they're doing that. I guess we're not a launch title anymore. What does that mean for us? And um, and we weren't we were in the trenches, so we weren't seeing the aspects of the big picture that we couldn't see, and that I think was one of them. It was like, what does that really mean? Why release it before it's ready? People are going to want games. What does that do? They get a nice initial rush of sales. Um, and I mean, they had some. I think there were some pretty good titles at launch. Like, was Panzer Dragoon a launch title? I don't remember. That was a Yeah, that was a really pretty. I mean, that was one of those things you look at that and and say, "Wow, this is really neat." When you see a product like that, I remember we just loved playing that, even though it was just a rail shooter. It was pretty fun and visually very nice. Yeah. Yeah, no. I think it was just two. I think it was just Virtua Fighter and Panzer Dragoon.
really?
And I mean, they were both good titles.
Mm,
They were both good titles. Um, Virtua Fighter, of course, was eclipsed later by other more true to the arcade experiences.
right.
Um, but yeah. The problem was that between May and September, they didn't have anything they could release. There was just like no. Everybody was on a development cycle for the September release. So, a bunch of games came out in September, October, and not many came out beforehand. And I think any that did, if any did, they were probably buggy. They probably had problems.
Right. Because they suddenly like 5 months of their or so of their development time was just chopped right off, right?
Right, right. So, like, I think by the launch by May, we had like alpha versions in QA. So QA at Sega of America had, I think, an alpha version of Ghen War. And I think that was probably true because there was like a developers conference in, I'm trying to remember. I think it might have been March. Oh no, it wasn't. It was early. It was February. And in February, we were reasonably far along with terrain, and we had flyovers working on the terrain, which was pretty neat, and that kind of wowed the audience. People were pretty happy to see that because I think up until that time, people were concerned that the Saturn couldn't do 3D at all. So when they saw that we were getting terrain flyovers and that like textured polygon terrain, people were a lot more confident that the system could perform. It was just that uh, yes, it could do that, but you were pushing uphill to get it to do that.
So that's kind of neat. It sounds like at that developers conference or whatever that was, you guys kind of helped convince people that yeah, the Saturn can kind of do 3D to some extent. Like it's
Right.
still pretty capable.
Yeah, yeah, it's still pretty. It was pretty capable. I mean, the processing power was excellent. You had two really quite fast RISC-based chips in there that were running, like 28 megahertz each, which at the time was decent. I mean, the my development platform for Ghen War was an IBM PC clone with a 486 processor on it, running at 50 megahertz. And the SH2 RISC chips, the pair of them, could beat that for processing power. Um, so in terms of like straight raw throughput, what they couldn't do was they couldn't do the floating point that the 486 had. 486 has a floating point chip built into it, but that wasn't the point with the with those. So you're doing basically integer-based 3D graphics, which is kind of tricky. You can do it. You can do it with fixed point integers and stuff. Gosh, I'm really dragging up old memories now, old technological memories. Um, but it was a it was a nice pair of CPUs, and you could have one CPU working on one process and another CPU working on another. So essentially, you had had dual tasking, like a dual core CPU, dual core system, and uh, and that was pretty damn good. So it was possible for it to do all the computations to compute it, and then draw it, and in a separate thread. So we actually had, I think, the equivalent of multiple threads running. And gosh, yeah. The other thing I just remembered now, the other thing that the Saturn really lacked that the PlayStation had was a method of compositing graphics. Um, Part of drawing polygons is being able to control the level of transparency when you draw, so that a a polygon can merge on top of another polygon, so you can create, things that you can see through. It's particularly important for things like fire and smoke and explosions, because you want to be able to sort of see the graphics behind where the explosion is going, not
Right.
just flat it down, right? And the Saturn didn't have any capability of mixing. Like, it was essentially, the display was write only. You could write the display, but you could never read back from it. And because of that, you couldn't composite things onto the screen, and that's really pretty fundamental for creating a layered effect in 3D. There's SIGGRAPH papers and all kinds of research and stuff done on it, and the graphics engine in some of the other systems, the Nintendo 64 and the PlayStation PlayStation, had compositing in them, and the Saturn didn't. So even though you could draw a polygon, making it do a really nice looking explosion, ooh, you were on your own.
Right.
Yeah, you were in trouble.
You couldn't see
And
behind the explosion or the smoke or anything like that.
yeah, yeah, and the PlayStation had sort of like positive and negative compositing, so you could add or subtract the display, so you could like brighten up an area, and that capability didn't really exist. You had to do a lot of work to get the equivalent effect, and honestly, some of those effects just weren't possible to do on the Saturn, and so technologically, that aspect of the Saturn was a bit of a failure, um, uh, and I think ultimately, because of it, games just looked better on the other consoles. Um, I think the Saturn was a hardware platform that was designed to implement arcade-style games. And like the generals of World War One, they were preparing to refight the last battle. And it could clearly win at that. I mean, you could make an awesome looking Tempest. You could have make a fantastic Altered Beast or equivalent type game. You know, one of those ones where they're giant flat polygons that beat each other up. Street Fighter, right? Like Street Fighter would be awesome on the Genesis, but oh, not the Genesis, on the Saturn. But it would also be decent on one of the other platforms. It just wouldn't, you know, like you could have 120 frame graphics running on a Saturn if you're doing 2D backdrops, but but as soon as you try to do 3D, it failed. And since everybody was moving to 3D, that was something that the Saturn had been left behind. You know, it had like lost its edge. Yeah.
Or saying that they were like the generals of World War I preparing for yesterday's battle, kind of a thing, you know?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, it's exactly what it was. It was they were totally ready to you know, to hide behind the Maginot Line or whatever it was. You know, and meanwhile they got steamrolled by 3D graphics on the other platforms and people coming at it from a different angle. Yeah.
Did you feel early on, like while developing Ghen War, did you feel that 3D was kind of a last minute addition to the console's hardware?
It really did feel that way, yes. Yeah, yeah. They had two VDPs in the system, VDP1, VDP2. One did the backgrounds and was really pretty full featured, even if it was horribly documented. And the second was the VDP. The other one, I can't remember which was one and which was two, did the polygon engines, the line. It was basically a line drawing chip. It could draw lines really fast. And and that did feel a bit tacked on. Like yeah. I think the short answer to that is yes. Yeah.
That is interesting. Yeah, they definitely hear that a lot nowadays, and I was just curious if that's something that people realized, you know, back before it even came out. And I guess you guys experienced that firsthand. So
Oh, absolutely. And as I said earlier, we were in the trenches, and you could see that that aspect of the system was not well thought out. I mean, it was a clever solution to a problem that they hadn't really thought through. Right? They knew they needed to be able to draw polygons, so they said, "Well, we've got this thing that can draw lines. Let's just use it to draw polygons." And that was not the right answer. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I guess just as someone who had a ton of experience, like just really working on this console and working on like an early game for it, do you feel that this would have been a much better system if Sega had spent like even 5 more months working on the console's hardware?
Yes, I'm not sure that 5 months on the hardware would have been a good idea. It would have been enough. I think um, they needed to. They actually, I mean, fundamentally, what they needed to do was have a polygon engine in it, and to do that, they would have had to have grafted in a chip from. I mean, basically, they had a polygon engine in development at that time, or shortly afterwards, which was the one used in the Dreamcast. Um, and that also was a sidetrack from kind of the mainstream. It was actually a pretty powerful chip, but it was not. The approach they were taking was sort of a sidetrack from the mainstream. So I think to some extent, an additional 5 months probably wouldn't have made a difference because I don't think they could have improved the chip they had enough to make it work. Um, uh, Maybe. I mean, I've done a bit of hardware engineering, but not at that level, not at the chip design level, and I don't know how much they could have changed in that time frame. I mean, I think if they'd been able to implement a read modify write cycle, yeah, sorry, I hate to use the technical to go all deep and technical on you,
That's
but if
okay.
they'd been able to implement a read modify write and implement a compositing layer, they might have been able to salvage a bit more because they could have improved the look of the games, the 3D games, significantly with that. Um, but that's 2020 hindsight from years later.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, but
25 years
at
down
the
the line, they can't exactly
yeah,
go back
exactly.
on.
Yeah. At the time, it was all, this is wrong, guys, but I don't know what you're going to do to fix it. Yeah.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
The plot line of the game. It sounds like you guys had written some kind of a plot for this game, but you got something else back when whoever produced the films and the cutscenes made it.
Oh,
Tell me about
oh
that.
my. Yeah. Yeah. We had a script. I'd done the bulk of the writing on the script. Greg had helped. So we had a storyline. Um, I still got a copy of it somewhere. And we gave it to them and said, "Hey, look, this is what we want to do for the script." And they took the script and shopped it around I guess they shopped it around in Hollywood. And our producer had a contact in Hollywood who was like an aspiring producer. And he got his own writer to write the story, which is the one that came in the game. And they redid the whole story concept completely. and unfortunately, Hollywood's idea of science fiction kind of begins and ends with, at that time, began and end with mind control and the puppet masters and stories that had been in science fiction since the 1930s, but we've moved along since then. And
Right.
so it was kind of disappointing to get this thing that came back that was just like, yeah, this is so cliched, and anyway, I mean, I think the actors did fine. I think parts of it were good. It was just one of the things where it wasn't what we wanted, but we didn't have any sort of power to really change it. And so anyway, I, yeah. It's one of those things where I'd love to ream them for screwing it up so badly, but ultimately they were the one paying the bills, and so they get to make those choices.
Right. No,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
unfortunate,
mm,
but it makes
mm,
sense.
yeah,
What was the
yeah,
plot like? What was the plot line that you guys originally had in mind? You said that at the time Hollywood's idea of science fiction involved a lot of mind control. What were you
yeah.
guys thinking it would be?
I, w- in some ways, it was more straightforward. Gosh, again, I would probably have to go back and reread it to do it,
Right.
but but the concept of the betrayal happened. It was common to both plots, that we'd met this aliens race. They were helping us. They were in running in fear of something else, and um, I think we had set it up so that while they were running in fear of something else, they were really scouts. They were scouts for the bad guys. And so the first part of the Ghen War was we were fighting back the Ghen, and then if there was a sequel, we'd be fighting the Bo Kayat or whatever the name was. Yeah, that's what it was. Yeah, the originals, and we had a plot line that um, allowed us to change the story. So we had A and B outcomes for, like, if you won or you lost a scenario, you would go to a different you would go to a different location, and the system, different things would be available to you. Ultimately, well, from an adventure perspective, from a sort of like a choose your own novel perspective, that's kind of a neat idea. From a video game standpoint, it doesn't work very well because most people will just, if they fail on a mission, will stop and restart and play it again till they win it. And if you try and do a tree of missions, and success and fail missions, nobody ever sees the fail missions because they work their way through to the successes. So a big chunk of the work you've done doesn't get used. So I think ultimately that was probably a good choice. I think we still had a few different endings, uh, depending on how successful you were, but I don't recall the all of the details. That was a while back. I do know that we absolutely maximized the use of the height map engine to create different terrains and systems. I think Ghen War had the cityscapes in it. Um, yeah. and those were all done with the same engine. We just interpreted the data slightly differently to create the skyscrapers and the jumping from the building tops to building tops and leveling the city and stuff. And today I'd look back and go, oh my gosh, that's so primitive. But at the time, it felt pretty neat.
Right.
Mm.
Still seems pretty neat today, if you're comparing it to the other games at the time for sure, like in the mid 90s and kind of the dawn of the 3D graphic age, and now we're blowing up deformable terrain and blowing up buildings and stuff like that, and it definitely was really cool at the time for sure.
Oh, well, thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
like I said, I'm a sucker for the dinosaur era games, so I think it's really fun. I'm a big fan of it for sure.
Cool. Well, cool.
If you look back at some of the reviews, like some of the older magazines like EGM and all those people and GamePro and the like, it sounds like a lot of the opinions were like really mixed. Like you either loved it or you hated it, kind of a thing.
Yeah.
What was that like? Kind of looking at those.
Oh, as a developer, you do feel. I mean, it's like an actor or anyone who's involved in a creative thing. You would really prefer it if everybody loved the product you worked on, but not everybody does. And some of the reviews were harsh. Some of them were valid. Um, at the time that it came out, the Saturn was already kind of, I wouldn't say it was in decline, but it was clear that Sony was beating it. And so a lot of the reviews of Saturn games, I think, got pretty harshly treated because Sony was the media darling. And some of that I feel I can ascribe to Sega's management. Remember how I said earlier that they had been on top with the Genesis and they got kind of arrogant. And so they stopped helping the developers and helping the media, and they kind of forgot what made them so good, right? When the Genesis was the console coming out to beat Nintendo, they would go out of their way to help the media and stuff like this. Then they got to be number one. They're all powerful, and suddenly they're no longer quite so interested in helping people get stuff done or provide stuff. I mean, there were plenty of people inside Sega who did really good work, and did what they could. But the management attitude, the total attitude, was poor, and so it was really easy for the video game magazines and articles to slam on products because if Sega's being a jerk to you and the console's not doing so well, then let's just dump on it. But I'm going to say that I think some of the criticism was definitely deserved. I think Sega had their goals. They had things that they wanted us to do. In particular, they were very concerned about some of the technical aspects that I think were kind of got in the way of us polishing the game. I remember spending an awful lot of time trying to solve some crazy little technical problems to do with polygon dropouts that you didn't even notice. It was stuff that you couldn't see, and we'd spent like a month working on that we really should have spent working on polishing the title, on polish. And
Right.
yeah, it's a bizarre. I don't know. It's one of those odd things that, like, you look back and you go, why did we spend so much time on that when this other thing was slapping us in the face?
Right, that
Yeah.
makes sense. So you guys were kind of focusing almost more energy on Sega's shortcomings with their console and their help with developers than the actual game itself.
Oh,
Is that correct?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. We spent quite a bit of time dealing with, yes, yeah, with console issues and with their requirements that weren't as important. Like, if you're familiar with modern console development, the manufacturers have a set of standards that they want you to adhere to. They're called technical requirements, or Nintendo used to call them lot checks. There's a bunch of names for them, but basically it's a listing, and the larger companies have compliance departments. They have basically a QA department that before the game even gets submitted to the manufacturer, it has to go through this process. And they'll do it internally, like for sure Activision does, and I'm sure EA does as well. And so that by the time it gets to the first party, whether it's Microsoft or Sony these days, or Nintendo, they know it's going to pass because they've put it through an even more rigorous set of tests than the manufacturer will do, because they don't want to waste time getting it bounced. And even with that, sometimes the products will bounce back once or twice. But Sega at that time didn't really have a defined set of standards like that. So we would get bounced back for stuff that we didn't know why it was being bounced. And they didn't have a really clearly defined set of requirements, of technical requirements, like the simple ones on Nintendo and Sony would be things like this button must always be used to exit to the menu. This button must always be used for movement control. You must do this when a disc is ejected accidentally. You must do this when such and such happens. And Sega didn't have a set of designs for that, for the Saturn, at least not at that time. They had one for the Genesis, or at least they had part of one, but it wasn't very long. I mean, this is like 94, 93, 94. And as we were heading into 95, we're going through this process, and we kept getting bounced back for requirements that we didn't know about before we submitted. So
what kinds of like requirements were they? Was it like those consistency things where it's like the B button goes back, the A button advances forward in menus kind of a thing, or was it like other things?
There was some of that. Some of it was, I remember spending a lot of time trying to figure out why polygon in the foreground would disappear sometimes and not at other times, and like what the thing was. And that was a graphic dropout was what they called it. And we spent all this time, we eventually solved it, eventually did figure out what it was. And then like the next month Sega released the Daytona game, where as soon as you drove near a building, it would drop out and you'd get a big hole and see the background. And I remember going, I just wasted a month of my life solving that problem, and Sega's own products don't do it. I was like, yeah.
That must have been frustrating.
Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah. So
yeah. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was going to say you can actually see this. I think if you're playing Ghen War and you walk really close to a cave or a mountainside, sometimes you'll see little holes in the terrain at the bottom, like little triangle diamond shapes where you can see where the polygons join. You can see through, and then if you go play Daytona, just drive your car right near the edge of the track, and there'll be a giant, enormous, gaping view through to the background, the backs of
Jeez.
Yeah. It was one of those things. It's like, I at the time I was pretty mad, but I look back and go, idiots.
Right. Yeah. Was that one of their like technical requirements that they bounced you guys back for, or was that just like, oh, okay?
No.
They bounced you guys back for a graphical dropout, but then had it in their first Daytona game.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, their first party products. Yep, exactly. Yeah.
That's rough.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So do you still own a copy of Ghen War?
Yeah. Actually, after you mentioned it, I went and looked in my closet, and there was I still got a sealed copy. And I'm pretty sure somewhere I've got a Saturn. I don't have one set up at the moment though.
Right.
Yeah.
You thinking about cracking it open at some point soon?
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm like really super tempted to do that now.
Makes sense. That's funny. And then one thing I noticed in the game, and this is something that I've always really enjoyed about 90s shooters games, it's a very mundane thing for me to mention here, but I really like how strafing is faster than any other movement in the game.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
You could go sideways faster than you could do anything else. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That was something I really
Yeah.
enjoyed. I've definitely like, all right, I gotta get to the end of this cave now, and I've already collected the whatever item it was to explode the strontium refinery. But it's a really
Yeah.
long path, and then I just went sideways, and I was out in like 5 seconds.
That's crazy. Yeah. I think part of that was that 3D games were pretty new, and like particularly first-person shooters, and so one of the ways you could tell you're in a 3D environment was if you go sideways. Because like if you just walk forward, you might or might not be in a 3D world. Like imagine what was the motorcycle racing game? Oh my gosh, I can't remember it now.
Oh, there's a few of those. There's like Road Rage,
Road Rage. Road
or
Rage was the
Road
one I was
Rash, I
thinking of.
think it was. Sorry,
Road
I got
Rash,
the
yeah,
name
Road
wrong.
Rash.
Yep.
Right, yeah, Road Rash. That wasn't a 3D game,
Right.
and you only moved forward, and so you were basically fooled into thinking you were in a 3D world by basically by scrolling graphics. But if you got to move sideways, then you could see that it was 3D because the perspective changed. So developers like to have sideways movement in their games so that you could see this perspective change. And yeah, the world really is 3D because as you go side to side, you see the background shifts in different amounts to the foreground, and all the perspective changes. So we wanted, so yeah, going sideways, it was fast.
Nice, nice. And you guys wanted it to be fast, right? Like,
Yeah, we
dude,
wanted to be fast.
that's funny. I didn't know
Although
that.
I have to admit, I have not heard of someone using the strafe to get out of a level faster. That's pretty good.
So let's talk about map design now that you mention it.
Yeah.
This was a pretty early 3D game. Um, as you kind of progress throughout the 90s and you look at games like, I don't know if you played the first Spyro of the Dragon, but they really utilized landmarks as a way to keep the player in the know as to what part of the map they're in. Like, oh, I remember this structure, so I'm at this south point of the map. And it seemed like
Yeah.
you guys kind of started implementing that too, back when
Yeah.
3D worlds were still a pretty early thing. Tell me about like kind of your strategy with making some of those 3D worlds memorable and making certain areas like, oh, this is where I am, kind of the thing.
Yeah, we would sometimes do that with textures. So there'd be a particular pattern or texture that we would put on the ground, essentially like a blaze, like a marker. Um, Other times, so one of the big limits on those early systems was the depth of field, because the engine couldn't actually draw that many polygons and maintain frame rate. Your ability to see in the distance was kind of limited. So we had the fog effect or fog of war effect. So the draw distance was limited, and sometimes we do that by putting you in an interior and making sure there are always turns in the passages. That's why, like a lot of early games, the passageways and hallways are all twisty and turny. Like nobody builds buildings like that.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But in a video game we did because you'd have short range things. So what we would have to do is to put place markers. You put an object in a location that you come back to fairly frequently, and that way you know where you are. And so sometimes a map might have a central area that you go to and come back to, and that way you had like a visual anchor for where you were. Other times we'd make the levels much more linear, so you're basically going through a zigzag. But if you ever do it with a maze, like so there are multiple passageways and stuff like that, that's when people get lost because you end up going around in circles. And if I remember, we tried to avoid that, but with the deformable terrain, you could end up making them yourself. So so we tried. I can't remember. I think in Ghen War, I know we did in Congo. We actually marked the terrain, the deformable terrain, explicitly, so you could see visually that you could change it.
Like
And I
with
think
different
in
textures and things like that.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and I don't remember if we did that in Ghen War or not. It's been a long time. I mean, you've played it recently. Did you notice that if the terrain you could deform was different looking, or could you just destroy anything?
The thing I noticed, it really depended. I know at the end of the first Mars level, there's like a light green mountain that you have to blow away to get to the end of the level. That was very different from the red textures of Mars that were surrounding you, at any other point in that map. But there were other
Right, right.
parts
Yeah.
like other caves that had like places of the wall that you could blow away, but you had to like check the map, like the map on your pause menu to see like, oh, this shade of green that marks a wall is slightly lighter. That means I can blow this away.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Right, right. Yeah, I think that first Mars level was to teach you that you could deform the terrain. Like, you're trying to teach the player as they're playing the game the capabilities. It's like a almost tutorial, but without actually being a tutorial.
Right.
So yeah, yeah,
Oh, that
yeah.
makes sense. And I saw you guys hit an extra life in there. Were
Oh
there?
yeah.
I guess more so for my own sake, I haven't actually been able to beat the game yet. I'm kind of getting hung up at the moon still. Any other
Oh.
places you happen to remember where you guys snuck in a few extra lives?
It was 30 years ago, 20 years ago. That's a
Dang.
no. That's a no.
All right. It was worth asking.
But I do remember that w- uh, on the moon, that's when you come across the spider guys, isn't it?
Yeah, those were
Yeah,
wicked.
yeah, yeah, yeah. They were wicked. That was one of those things where there was a really happy coincidence where we were working on the movement routines, and Greg's brother Eric, who was another programmer, worked with me on the title. Again, he should be in the credits as well. Um, and Eric um, wrote a really simple kind of algorithm for the spider bot movement, the spider enemies movement, and they were so creepy because they looked like spiders. They moved like spiders. They turned to before they moved, they would turn. So they would turn to face you or turn away and then move. And that's spiders like that. They have a fixed field of view. They fixed vision. So they always turn first before they start moving. So they would turn and then they would move, and their moves were very insectile, and it was like super creepy. Like if you have a fear of spiders, you don't want to play that level.
Makes me happy.
Yeah.
I got over my arachnophobia long before starting Ghen War, so that definitely
Oh,
would have.
good. Yeah, definitely helps. Yeah.
A lot of the reviews, both back then and even modern day reviews, mention the draw distance in Ghen War and it being pretty exceptionally short. And
Hmm.
kind of for fifth gen games, that was a big challenge even later on in the 90s. Like with games like Tenchu Stealth Assassins, all the levels took place at night because they needed some kind of
Yep.
an excuse to have the, have that black fog in the background.
Yep. That it was a complete pain in the butt.
I bet. I bet. Tell me more about kind of dealing with the draw distance. Was that like just completely unavoidable at the time?
It was pretty much unavoidable. If you could imagine a game where, I mean, a lot of times we would try to set up a game where you could have a background that you could see and have the terrain fade into the background and have that work. But even with that, you ended up with you'd end up with holes at the back, like you'd be able to see the background drawing as you moved towards it, and um, that kind of stuff really still existed throughout into the early 2000s. It wasn't really until we started getting third and fourth generation video graphics cards on the PCs that started to go away. I mean, it was still a massive problem on the Xbox and even the Xbox 360. I think they're pretty good now. The newest PlayStations and Xbox One, the graphic draw distances can be pretty far because the GPUs are good enough. Are up there, but even even in modern games like Skylanders, we still have to deal with draw distance, even though they're relatively simple worlds. You still have to deal with it, and sort of common ways of dealing with it were oh yeah, let's play at night and fade to black. Great, good trick, works well.
Right.
Okay. Oh, you're on Venus. That worked really well in Ghen War. You're on Venus. Oh, there's this foggy chlorine atmosphere that you can't see more than 50 feet in. Oh, great, perfect. That's a great level.
Right.
Yeah. Or you're in caves, and every 20 feet will turn the corner 90 degrees.
Exactly. Solves that problem
Yeah.
right away.
Yeah, solves that problem. Yeah, but not good for gameplay. I mean, you ideally you want good distances that you can shoot in, and so you can create long range shots and move around and stuff. And so yeah,
So definitely
definitely a problem.
unavoidable challenge, I guess.
Yeah, unavoidable challenge. You could actually draw out as far as you liked, but you'd have no frame rate, right? I mean, if you really wanted to take the time, you could spend a second per frame and create a absolutely beautiful crystalline image, but no one would be able to play the game.
Would be running at like 2 frames per second or something like that.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Were you guys able to make it so that like enemies would be able to draw from a further distance, or would that not have like worked out too well?
It's getting enemies to draw at distance. You could do it. I've got to think about it. Basically, the problem there is that means that your enemies are effectively giving off light, right? Because in order to be able to see them, it is so I don't remember whether we did that or not. I think we might have done it in some places, like maybe some of the night missions. We might have done that, just so that you could see them from further away. Yeah.
That makes sense. I didn't notice it myself too much. I mean, there were a few cave levels where, I don't remember the exact name of them, but those big green tank things. I was at the end of like the second Mars level, and I had like maybe 2 hit points left, and there were 2 of those green tanks at the end, and I was actually able to snipe them from pretty far away with those homing missiles before like completing the level. I like screamed when I beat it. I was like, "Oh my god, I made it! I didn't die! This is great!" But I think I'll have to play it through again with this in mind. I don't remember if there were certain levels that had them draw from further away or not, but I was definitely able to snipe those 2 green tank guys in a cave level.
Oh, awesome. Excellent. Hey, I will apologize for how difficult the games are in that era. One of the reasons the games were difficult was because we were using feedback from the QA departments as to difficulty levels. And let me tell you, that's a nice rookie designer mistake, because the guys who play in the QA departments get really, really, really freaking good at games.
That makes sense.
And so they were always asking us to ramp up the difficulty level. So some of the games, some of the early games got super hard because we were using QA for feedback on difficulty, and they just got more and more challenging. That was definitely a problem for us on Racing Aces back when we did that on the Genesis.
Oh yeah.
That was super hard because QA had kept telling us that it was too easy, and it's like, and anyway, final product was almost unplayable.
Oh, I wouldn't
because
say it was
of that.
unplayable, but it's definitely challenging for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just gonna say, I think by the time Ghen War and Conga came out, we'd been able to back away from QA and say, no, you guys are over the top. Yeah.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
My goal is to be able to get to the Australia levels at least before I review the game, but we'll see how far I get. I managed to review NHL All-Star Hockey without scoring a single goal, so that's a whole other story in itself. But
yeah. Oh, they must have listened to their QA department too.
Oh, they must have. That game was just oof. It was not really well designed, like at all. But that's a whole other story.
Yeah.
I don't think you worked on that one. So.
No, I didn't. No. It's interesting though. The evolution of game design has got it's had stops and starts, but that's definitely one of them. Is you like knowing we used the QA department. What we should have been using is focus groups, focus tests,
Yeah.
and subsequent products we have relied on focus tests more and QA less. QA is great for finding bugs. They're great for finding cheats and flaws. Not so good for design and public and the public perception of the game, because they're so focused on what they're trying to do and they get so good at the game. Focus tests are really good. You put a game down in front of a bunch of 7 and 8 year olds, and you can see that they're going to have difficulty with things. And so, and for later products, I worked on a whole bunch of products that were more aimed at kids. Madagascar, Tony Hawk's Downhill Jam, and then subsequently Skylanders, which was definitely a kid-friendly, kid-oriented product, and those would not have been successful with the older design environments, because without focus tests and being able to see kids trying to do things in the game, you don't realize until you do that how difficult it is for people to do something. Like I'm sure that if we were doing Ghen War now, we would have we'd take levels and we'd have people come in and play it, and we would see what was causing them difficulties. We'd probably also implement metrics to figure out how fast it took people to get from point A to point B, how long it took them to solve particular puzzles, and you basically smooth stuff out and polish it so that it's playable. Those things didn't exist in '94.
So you guys just didn't have focus testing at the time, like that wasn't a thing game designers did really.
No,
Okay.
yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Off-topic question, if you will, but would Skylanders have just been like freakishly impossible if it was only tested by Ghen War's QA department?
Oh yeah. Yes. We wouldn't have got made. and I don't want to blame the Ghen War's QA department. I mean, they definitely helped us find bugs, but using all I'm really saying is don't use your QA department for your for your difficulty level.
Right.
Yeah.
Definitely still useful, but not for that.
Oh yeah, different purpose. Yeah. No, I mean, I'm sure there were at the time, but I think it was one of those things where in those days, getting full motion video into your video game was regarded as a coup. I remember I worked with the guys at Crystal Dynamics when they did the Horde, and they got Kirk Cameron to be the lead actor on one of the things, and that was a major win, because up until that time it was really, really rare to get an A or even a B-list actor to be in a video game. And so just getting full motion video, and we were essentially, I think most of the actors in the videos were kind of like fresh graduates. They were actors at the beginnings of their careers. They may have gone on to do other things, or they may not have. I really don't know. But they were. It was getting full motion video done was hard, and getting it integrated into the game was difficult. So it was one of those things where we were just ramping it up. And the Sega had the Sega CD, the 32X, and the Sega Saturn, and they were some of the earliest consoles to use CDs as a delivery method. And that prior to that, you couldn't have done full motion video simply because you couldn't fit it on the cartridge. You couldn't fit it on the floppy disk with your video game. Yeah. In Ghen War, I was essentially the programmer, lead programmer, lead engineer. I wrote the initial script. We did a lot of game design. I worked with Greg Hammond, who was the lead designer, and his brother Eric, who was like the assistant programmer. And it started off as a partnership with Greg and myself, and then Greg had to move for personal reasons. He had to go back to the Midwest. And so we were working sort of remotely with him. And this was right as pretty much as Ghen War was wrapping up. And so as it was wrapping up, we combined with another group. We had 3 or 4 groups sharing an office. And we combined with one of the other groups to form a company called Jumping Jack. And so the first part of Ghen War was done as Hammond and Leyland, but it was finished as Jumping Jack software. And that was mostly through the QA process. So Greg was heavily involved right up until the last couple of months of Ghen War, and and Eric stayed around, but Greg for I don't remember the reasons, but he had to leave, and it did make finishing a little bit tricky. But it was really a small team. I mean, it was just Greg and I for the first almost year of development, and then Eric for the last 3 months, and then we had a little bit of art support from both inside Jumping Jack and at Sega. They actually got someone to help us out with it, and of course there was like integrating the videos and all that kind of stuff to do it as well. It was just a couple of days earlier, I think. We were, like we're working, and we pretty much every week would talk to our producer, and oh my gosh, I can't remember his name right now. I can picture him, I can see him, and I've run into him. But he let us know, I think, like maybe 2 days before, and we were like, okay. No, I mean, thank you for doing this interview. I'm really glad that the people are actually paying attention to the earlier products, and by the time of the Saturn, it was sort of mid in the game development environment, and there were a lot of things that happened that were crazy and wild, but it was fun, and I would do it again. You know? Yeah. I mean, why, I wouldn't change anything in terms of, there were lessons we had to learn, and that was a good way to. It was pretty good. It was fun. I for all my beefs about the Sega management and actually some of the hardware, some of the issues with the hardware, it was actually a pretty fun machine to program for. As a software developer, it was a blazing fast CPU, and you could really crank it to do tricks. Like the PlayStation, you pretty much you could get something going on the PlayStation really easily, but you couldn't push it. Like it didn't have it had a very kind of fixed end point, whereas the Saturn, there was always more stuff that you could crank on. Like you could dual process, you could use the sound processor to help you out, you could use the video processor to help you out. There was always more things you could get working inside it. And so it was a machine where I don't think anyone actually ever reached the limits of the machine before it had gone away. Yeah, I think, well, they probably came closer because they did some amazing stuff. But yeah, I think it was one of those machines where you could probably have continued to push the hardware for quite a bit. I mean, obviously it got superseded. You bring out newer machines, and in some ways I think it deserved its death. But put us out of our misery, please. But yeah, I mean, it was a good product. I think spoiled by too many mistakes, and I think that may be true of them. That's probably true of a lot of things. But yeah, it was fun. It was good. It was a good time.
Is there anything else that you wanted to add, or is that pretty much covered?
No, that was just saying that I appreciate the chance to tell some of the story. It's really good, and I look forward to seeing the results in the review.
Perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for speaking with Mr. Leyland. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thanks, Nick. Thanks a lot.
All right. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.